There's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joining us from Istanbul is Metin Gurcan. He's a security analyst and columnist for Al Monitor's Turkey Pulse. With us here in Washington is the U.S. representative for Turkey's pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, Giran Ozcan. Dlshad Othman is a Kurdish-Syrian activist and cyber-security specialist, and Edmund Ghareeb is a Middle East scholar and analyst. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Edmund Ghareeb, let me start with you. The Turks are hitting Kurdish targets in northern Syria. The Kurds are returning fire, but clearly without American support, they're outgunned. What impact is all this going to have?
Well, there's no doubt that this is a major development. It may be a turning point in the region as well, for the Kurds, for Syria, and maybe even for Turkey, depending on how things evolve. If we see a resistance to the Turkish invasion, we are likely, and it continues, this may drag Turkey more and more into a quagmire inside Syria, the same as some of the other players have seen and have witnessed. It may also has implications for the regional scene as a whole, because this is an issue, the Kurdish issue is an issue for Iran, for Iraq, for Turkey, and for Syria. And this issue I have said a long time ago, and I've repeated this a number of times, that the Kurdish genie is out of the bottle. Yeah. And it's going to be difficult to put that genie back in the bottle again. Nevertheless, this does not necessarily mean that we are likely to see anytime soon the emergence of a Kurdish state in any of the countries of the region. So there is that implication. In addition to that, there is also the international aspect of it, whether it's the Europeans who are concerned about the flow of refugees from Syria, who are concerned about Turkey maybe allowing some of their refugees to go into Europe. In addition, Russia and the United States are major players in Syria and in the region, and their relations are going to be affected. Iran is also a major player. So this is a complicated, and it could be a potentially dangerous and a messy situation.
Do you believe that the Kurds can pose to effective resistance against the Turkish right now? As you said, the Turks could be drawn into a quagmire, but do you see a prolonged military campaign here?
There's no doubt that there is no balance without outside support, either from the United States. The Turks are even looking now to the Europeans. There was a meeting between one of the leaders of the Syrian Democratic Forces with the president of France. So nevertheless, I think without outside support, and even that is questionable now after what we have seen in the last few weeks and last few days especially, with the U.S. Pulling out from the border region. Nevertheless, there is going to be, as a result of this, while there is no balance between the Turkish forces and the Syrian forces, the United States has provided sophisticated weaponry to the Syrian Democratic Forces. Yeah. And if they decide to resist, unlike what happened in Afrin, I think they could make the Turks pay a heavy price. Right. In fact, we've already begun to see some of that. Some Turkish soldiers have been killed, and today I heard, I don't know how accurate or how significant it was, there was an attack in Orfa against a Turkish government position, which is within about 40 kilometers inside Turkey from the Syrian border. So this means that the situation could get much, much bigger.
Right. Dlshad, you are Syrian Kurd. You have family there. In fact, you've been talking to your family in the region. What are you hearing?
Unfortunately, since 2011, my family stayed in their home. But yesterday, for the first time since 2011, they moved. So we had Assad government controlling us. We had SDF. The minute the Peace Springs operation or Turkey's invasion started,
so your family are not in the Kurdish-controlled area?
They are, actually. And they're in Qamishli, but Qamishli is being bombed too, so they had to leave Qamishli. Actually, there is at least 6 civilians died in attacks in different neighborhoods in Qamishli, so they had to leave their home. The situation is really bad. They're afraid. Turkey is currently actually bombing roads between different Kurdish cities, which means they are really also trying to push civilians not to leave their cities. So I would say they're trying to really burn civilians in their cities.
So what I mean, what's the future for the Kurds in this part of Syria?
I think we've always been in that part of Syria. We've always been in southern part of Turkey. So there is no way Turkey is going to be wiping us. I think we will resist. We will stay there. It's our land. It's our home. So we're not going to leave.
Okay. Let me bring in Metin Gurcan. He's in Istanbul. Metin, President Erdogan of Turkey, he says the mission is to, quote, prevent the creation of a terror corridor across the southern border and to bring peace to the area. He wants to establish this safe zone. It's a pretty big safe zone. It's going to be something like 32 kilometers deep into Syria and 500 kilometers long. Is that going to work? Who's going to police this safe zone?
Yeah, I mean, first, to better understand the current situation, I think we need to roll back to the summer of 2014. And in the summer of 2014, what we see is kind of initiation of a military cooperation with between the US military and then the Syrian Kurds in the fight against ISIS when they were resisting to hold Kobani town. Since then, for almost 5 years, what we see was the development of this military cooperation and YPGs, PKK-affiliated YPGs, gaining of some conventional military capacities, thanks to the help that they got from US military. And for almost 2 years, I had been saying that kind of armed conflict between Turkish military and YPG in the northeast of Syria had been inevitable. And this has been becoming to reality right now. We are facing with. Some were saying that the cooperation between American military and YPG has turned into a kind of Catholic marriage that cannot be broken. But I was thinking that this was going to lead a kind of divorce. But I had not expecting that this divorce would become such a fast and messy fashion.
Right, okay. Looking at the situation right now, how do you see this playing out? Has Turkey made a mistake here? Could it be drawn into a quagmire, as Edmund Ghareeb says?
Well, Anand, if you don't mind, before I get to that, I think Mr. Gurcan touches on some really good points about, and I think they give us a gateway to talk about the crux of the issue, actually, because, yes, the threat perception in Ankara revolves around this PKK corridor, but I think then we need to talk about the situation in Turkey, the Kurdish question in Turkey, which Turkish hostility towards Syrian Kurds is a complete extension of. When there was a peace process between 2013 and 2015, between the PKK and the Turkish government's perception of the Syrian Kurds, even the YPG, was completely different. The Turkish army and the YPG conducted a joint military operation in which they moved a tomb, in Syrian territory. PYD and YPG officials were visiting Ankara as a part of diplomatic efforts in how to move forward with the Syrian Kurds. So this is a complete and utter extension of Turkey's inability and unwillingness to solve its own Kurdish issue.
What changed?
Well, what changed was the peace process that had started in 2013 was no longer politically expedient for Recep Tayyip Erdogan. In the run-up to the 2015 elections, polls were going to Erdogan in which his vote was going down drastically. Us, as the HDP, I think, in that time, we doubled our votes, and Tayyip Erdogan lost his parliamentary majority, and was unable to form government.
So this is being driven by domestic Turkish politics rather than what is a threat from the Kurds?
Domestic Turkish politics and the history of the Turkish Republic both have converged at this point.
Okay. Edmund Ghareeb, there is, of course, another component to all of this, and that is ISIS. ISIS has been active in the region. In fact, this part of Syria was part of the caliphate that was created by ISIS. Here we have a spokesman for the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Turkey is trying through these attacks to open new lands for ISIS and extend the life of these groups. We do not agree with these attacks by Turkey and the people who support them. We send a message to the world. We will not target Turkey. But if they insist on attacking us and occupying our lands, we will defend ourselves until the last drop of blood. We are ready to face any kind of attack.
So what do you make of that, Edmund? Is this going to give an opportunity to ISIS to re-establish itself there?
The possibility is there. there's no doubt that ISIS has, to a large extent, has been destroyed. Right. Nevertheless, there are significant pockets that are still in Syria or still in Iraq. And so these could gain new momentum, new life. Some of them may even join some of the other Syrian armed opposition groups. But I think this is a little bit exaggerated. Nevertheless, the danger is there. But I think when we talk about ISIS, we have to remember something else. Well, there was no ISIS before the Iraq War.
Right.
It emerged after the Iraq War. The same thing with even Al-Qaeda. There was no Qaeda in Iraq. I think it's important to remember that U.S. interventions, whether it was in Iraq at that time, whether it's in Libya, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Afghanistan, these interventions have contributed to the rise of radical forces in these countries, especially forces like ISIS. Right. And today, what we see, while ISIS has more or less been undermined, the caliphate has been destroyed, the territory has been almost eliminated that it used to control. Nevertheless, ISIS has expanded. It's in Libya. It's in North Africa. It's in parts of Africa. It's in Afghanistan. Right. It's in Asia. So that means that basically one has to take into account the roots of this problem. These interventions have been very costly for the people of that region, of that part of the world, and they have been costly even for the United States.
Right, and they are ISIS prisoners who are being held by Syrian Kurds.
Today, for example, we've heard that ISIS has, some of the leaders of ISIS, some of the most dangerous groups from ISIS have been handed over by the Syrian Democratic Forces, by the Kurdish forces to the U.S. forces. And including the two most powerful figures within ISIS have been handed over to the U.S.
Okay. Dlshad, U.S. President Donald Trump, he made this decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria, and this is how he explained that decision. Let's watch this.
We want to bring our soldiers back home. These are the endless wars. And we're not fighting, we're policing to a large extent. We're policing in certain areas. We're not police, these are fighters.
And the president also said afterwards that the Kurds were not us in Normandy. I don't know what that was a reference to. But what do you make of that, the president's explanation?
I mean, yeah, 50 soldiers were actually preventing Turkey from targeting millions in northeast Syria. And I think the U.S. policed different countries. They're policing in South Korea. They're policing in Germany. What is the problem in that? What is the actual problem in policing and keeping peace? That can be the best thing the U.S. Army can really provide as a service to humanity. So I think it's pretty much a personal decision. It's based on one phone call Erdogan had with Trump and convinced him to just pull out the 50 soldiers that they were saving millions of lives.
What do you make of that decision, Giran?
Well, I think, firstly, we know that it completely blindsided the establishment here in the US.
Including the Pentagon.
Exactly. At the State Department, too, they've been working very hard to try and keep the peace there. There was a security mechanism in place, and the SDF were very committed to the framework of that mechanism. The fortifications were being destroyed along the border. But at one point, I think the investment that the Turkish government and Erdogan specifically made in its relationship with Donald Trump paid off. Yeah. And I think it's one of the most difficult jobs here in DC is trying to rationalize the approach or the decisions sometimes the president here makes. So, you know, high-level establishment officials, high-level government officials here in the US are unable to do that, so I would not even try to venture.
Okay, Edmund?
Basically, what I want to say is that this should not have come as a surprise. Basically, first of all, President Trump has been saying before, when he was a candidate as president and after his election, and as late as last December, he wanted to pull out from these so-called endless wars. Yeah. We saw that the Secretary of Defense resigned primarily because of this issue, because the president wanted to pull out from Syria. So the signs were there. Yeah. In addition, more significantly, the meeting that was held between President Erdogan and President Trump at the UN General Assembly was very significant, although there were different reporting that we got on it. The Turks had their own story, the Americans had their own story. Whether the president was on the same page engage and some of his advisors with the rest of the administration or not, or the rest of the...
But he must have been told what Turkey's intentions were.
Exactly. I mean, absolutely. And that's what I'm saying. I think so. That should have been was a signal. But more significantly, about a week ago, maybe 8 days ago, there was an article in one of the in a number of American papers where a U.S. official was quoted, a senior official. This official said a storm is brewing in northeastern Syria. He said, we may be forced to withdraw. We may not be, we don't have the forces to withstand the Turkish forces. And therefore, this may not work the way some people think. So there was a signal there. There were a number of signals. The question is, were they read correctly by the people involved? And in this case, were they read by the Kurdish-Syrian leadership in the way they should have read it?
Okay. Metin Gurcan, President Trump, of course, has threatened to, quote, obliterate the Turkish economy if President Erdogan attacks Kurdish. These are American allies. In fact, he said in a tweet, as I have stated strongly before, and just to reiterate, if Turkey does anything that I, in my great and unmatched wisdom, consider to be off limits, I will totally destroy and obliterate the economy of Turkey. I've done before. How is that threat being seen in Turkey?
I mean, first, we have to understand that the current question at hand, I mean, the armed conflict between PKK and Turkey, and then at the military level, the political question between Kurds and the host states, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. This is a complex, complicated, and multi-layered problem with historical background. And then this is a kind of problem that Mr. Trump cannot accurately understand. And then I think very first interest or prime motivation for him to share his ideas via tweets is right now he is under big pressure of forthcoming 2020 presidential elections. So he needs a kind of munition. He needs a kind of punch back to attack the Obama administration and the Obama administration policies over Syria, particularly the cooperation between Syrian Kurds and YPG and the American military. And also he has to attack the military establishment, security bureaucracy in the United States. So I think in a kind of asymmetric way, I am inclined to take his tweets not as kind of diplomatic ones, but his tweets as the ones directly designed for domestic political consumption.
Yeah. Okay, Dlshad, of course, you know, there's the politics of all of this. There's what's going on as far as the military is concerned in this part of Syria. But there's another aspect of this, and this is the humanitarian situation in Syria. Millions of people in Syria already have been displaced. Millions more have fled the country. They're now refugees in other countries. This, the United Nations is actually raising concerns about this. Let's listen to what the UN had to say.
We're worried. We're worried about what may happen, what would be maybe the implications on the ground. There are 6 million displaced people inside Syria. There is more than 5.5 million refugees in the neighboring countries. It's a conflict that has gone on for far too long, and therefore any operation that takes place at the moment has to take into account to ensure that we don't see any further displacement.
So what is the situation there? I mean, are people preparing for a pretty prolonged conflict?
Definitely. I mean, Turkey showed us a really good example when they went into Afrin, how they forced 250,000 people, specifically Kurds, to leave the city, how they took over their properties. So people still remember what happened in Afrin, and based on that, they're making decisions to leave. People left. Streets are full of cars, and everyone is moving toward Kurdistan region borders. That's where they think it's their destination in case Turkey advanced more in the region.
Giran, as Edmund Ghareeb says, this is a very complex situation. There's so many moving parts to it. If Turkey continues to hit these Syrian Kurdish targets in northeastern Syria, what stops the government forces of Syria, Bashar al-Assad's forces, from moving into this territory currently held by the Kurds?
So, Anand, I think that's the best question. Fundamentally, all of this boils down to one question. Do the Kurdish people, who number around 40 million across the region, do they have a right to exist as a people with their identity, with their culture, with their language. Because when we look at the host states right now, Turkey is hell-bent on crushing any sort of Kurdish political articulation, whether that's domestically, members of party, members of parliament from my party, who have never had anything to do with violence, who have never condoned violence, are in prison right now. Our former co-chairs have been in prison now for exactly 3 years. So domestically, it's crushing any sort of Kurdish political articulation for rights. Diplomatically, it's not allowing the Syrian Kurds to take part in any diplomatic avenue for the solution of the crisis there. And right now, it's taken that to the next step by bombing the whole of northern Syria right now. And yes, the Syrian state, one of the other host states, is also waiting to pounce now as the Syrian Kurdish attention is trying to defend themselves from a Turkish onslaught. So I think what the world needs to understand, what these host states need to understand, is that this is a distinct ethnicity, this is a distinct people that deserve the right to be able to live in their homeland of thousands of years with their own culture, with their own honor, and with their own language.
Metin, of course, there's been international concern and condemnation over what Turkey is doing. The European Union Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker, he has been calling for restraint. He said that if Turkey's plan involves the creation of the safe zone, well, don't expect the European Union to pay for it. There's been a very sharp response to that from President Erdogan. This is what President Erdogan had to say. Let's watch this.
Hey, Avrupa Birliği.
Hey, European Union. Get a hold of yourself. I say it again. If you try to frame our operation there as an invasion, our task is simple. We will open the doors and send 3.6 million migrants to you.
So what is that going to do for Turkish-EU relations?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question. I mean, the very first thing that I should say is this operation is not a kind of typical Turkish cross-border operations against PKK in northern Iraq, or this operation does not seem very similar to those previous operations, Europe's Shield or the Olive Branch operation in Afrin region against YPG forces. So this is a kind of new kind of operation. So in this operation we have 4 fronts. Very first front is the military one on the ground, and the second front is the domestic front. And Mr. Erdogan has been playing this very well. Everything is for domestic political consumption in Turkey right now. And we have to keep this fact in mind that when it comes to fight against PKK abroad, what we see is a kind of 70% popular support at the pocket.
Right.
So Mr. Erdogan knows that, and he knows that this will be a good opportunity for him. First, to consolidate people, both conservative nationalist power base and those anti-AK party people around his flag. And then this will be a good opportunity for him to disrupt the emerging unification of the opposition at the domestic front. And the third front is the diplomatic front. Regional players right now. We right now see Russia, Iran, they have a kind of wait-and-see policy. And as you said before, Damascus has been eager to expand to the north to take the control. And the Americans right now, they have a kind of paralyzed situation right now. I mean, their decision-making mechanisms are not working because of the Trump effect. And lastly, and I think most importantly, the fourth front is perceptional one. So winning hearts and minds of those people watching ongoing events in the northeast of Syria, particularly European capitals. The people living in the European countries, they are following this.
Right.
So, I mean, this is a delicate situation. Turkey should be very careful.
All right, we're running out of time.
This perceptional front.
Thanks, Metin. We're running out of time. Dlshad, I have one final point. One of the goals that President Erdogan has announced is that he wants to move Syrian refugees who are currently in Turkey into this safe zone. And there's some Kurds who've expressed some concern over this. They see this as an attempt to change the demographics of that part of Turkey. How much credence is there to that?
Definitely. I mean, we had an experience with that in the 60s when the Ba'ath regime, the government in Damascus, moved actually Arab families to the northern borders to cut us from our cousins in Turkey. I think it's the same, and it's not something that Turkey is hiding. We saw it in Afrin. In Afrin, Kurds were ethnically cleansed. Kurdish language is being expressed there. So I think this is something Turkey is willing to do, and they're planning to put in at least families of 15,000 of their mercenaries, Syrian mercenaries, that they came from different cities in that part of the country.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching. Hello everybody, I'm Anand Naidu. If you enjoy the thoughtful, engaged discussions you see on The Heat, you may also want to subscribe to our podcast. It's appropriately titled The Heat. Twice a week we take a deep dive on world headlines, talking to experts, journalists and others. It's a fresh, focused and intimate look at the issues that matter most. Whether it's the Hong Kong riots, the latest Middle East conflict or US politics, The Heat podcast gives the clear context needed to understand both what's going on and why. And what's best, we come to you. Whether you're at home or on the go, you can find The Heat podcast just about anywhere podcasts are found. Just search The Heat CGTN. Have a listen today and subscribe. Thanks.